May 1945. Germany was collapsing. American and Soviet forces were advancing from both sides, crushing what remained of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. But even as German armies surrendered, Allied intelligence officers knew that Germany possessed something potentially more dangerous than conventional military forces: advanced technology that was years ahead of anything the Allies had developed. And nowhere was this technological advantage more apparent than in Germany's rocket program. The V-2 rocket, Vergeltungswaffe 2 or Vengeance Weapon 2, was unlike anything the world had seen before. It was 46 feet tall, weighed over 27,000 pounds when fueled, and could carry a 2,000-pound warhead 200 miles. It launched vertically, climbed to the edge of space, reaching altitudes of over 50 miles, then descended at supersonic speed to strike its target. There was no warning, no air raid sirens, no time to take cover. The first indication that a V-2 was coming was the explosion when it hit. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany had launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. These rockets killed approximately 9,000 people and terrorized millions more. But what frightened Allied commanders most wasn't the damage the V-2 had already done. It was the realization that if Germany had developed this weapon just a year or two earlier, or if the war had lasted longer, the V-2 could have changed the outcome of the war. This was technology that represented the future of warfare. Now, with Germany defeated, both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted that technology. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans had built factories to produce V-2 rockets, research facilities where more advanced designs were being developed, and warehouses full of components. Most importantly, Germany had the scientists and engineers who understood how these rockets worked, men whose knowledge was worth more than any amount of captured equipment. Whoever seized these scientists and their secrets would gain a massive advantage in the post-war world. American intelligence teams, operating under various code names that would later be consolidated into Operation Paperclip, began searching Germany for anything related to the rocket program. They had rough locations of manufacturing sites and research facilities. But Germany was chaos in May 1945. Millions of refugees clogged the roads, cities were in ruins, and the Soviets were advancing from the east, conducting their own search for German technology. It was a race, and the Americans were determined to win. This is the story of how America captured Hitler's wonder weapon and turned it into the foundation of the space program that would eventually put men on the moon. This is the story of desperate searches through bombed-out factories, secret deals with German scientists, and a frantic effort to test fire a V-2 on American soil before anyone understood how it really worked. And this is the story of how 6 weeks of American determination and engineering genius transformed captured enemy technology into American power. The American search for German rocket technology focused on several key locations. Intelligence reports indicated that the main V-2 production facility was located at Mittelwerk, an underground factory complex near Nordhausen in central Germany. Additional research facilities were at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where the V-2 had been developed, and at various scattered sites throughout Germany where components were manufactured. But these locations were either in ruins or about to fall into Soviet hands. The Americans needed to find intact rockets, documentation, and most importantly, the scientists. In early May 1945, American troops discovered the Mittelwerk complex. What they found was both impressive and horrifying. The factory was built inside tunnels carved into a mountain, making it nearly invulnerable to Allied bombing. At its peak, Mittelwerk had produced 900 V-2 rockets per month using slave labor from the nearby Mittelbau Dora concentration camp. Approximately 60,000 prisoners had worked in the factory under brutal conditions. More prisoners died building V-2 rockets than were killed by the rockets themselves. A grim statistic that would haunt the rocket program for decades. Inside the tunnels, American troops found partial V-2 rockets, manufacturing equipment, and thousands of components. But much of the facility had been sabotaged by retreating Germans. And the Soviets would soon occupy this area, according to agreements made at Yalta. The Americans had only days to remove anything valuable before Soviet forces arrived. They began a frantic operation to truck V-2 components out of Mittelwerk and back to areas under permanent American control. Over the course of several days, American teams removed approximately 100 complete sets of V-2 components, enough parts to assemble 100 rockets. But components alone weren't enough. The Americans needed the knowledge to understand what they had captured. The V-2 was an enormously complex machine for its time, incorporating innovations in rocket engines, guidance systems, fuel pumps, and dozens of other areas. Without the original designers, the Americans might spend years trying to figure out how everything worked. Fortunately, the head of Germany's rocket program, Dr. Wernher von Braun, wanted to surrender to the Americans. Von Braun was one of the most brilliant rocket engineers in the world. He had joined the German rocket program in the early 1930s and had led the development of the V-2 from concept to operational weapon. He understood every aspect of the rocket's design and had been working on even more advanced designs when the war ended. He also understood that Germany had lost and that his knowledge made him valuable to whoever captured him. He deliberately sought out American forces to surrender, bringing with him several hundred engineers and scientists from the German rocket program. The meeting between von Braun and American intelligence officers was cordial but businesslike. Von Braun offered to work for the Americans in exchange for protection and the ability to continue his rocket research. The Americans, understanding the incredible value of what was being offered, agreed immediately. Over the following weeks, American teams rounded up more German rocket scientists and engineers. Eventually, over 1,600 German scientists and technicians would be brought to the United States under what became known as Operation Paperclip. The name Operation Paperclip came from the paperclips attached to the files of German scientists being processed for American employment. Many of these scientists had been members of the Nazi Party, and some had been directly involved in the use of slave labor at Mittelwerk. Under normal circumstances, they would have been prosecuted as war criminals. But the American government made a calculated decision. The knowledge these men possessed was too valuable to lose. And if America didn't take them, the Soviets would. So records were sanitized, questions weren't asked too closely, and German rocket scientists became American assets. Along with the scientists, the Americans captured an enormous amount of documentation. The Germans had maintained meticulous records of their rocket program, including detailed engineering drawings, test results, manufacturing procedures, and design studies for advanced rockets that had never been built. These documents, filling thousands of pages, provided a complete blueprint for reproducing and improving upon German rocket technology. American engineers studying these documents realized they had just saved decades of research and development time. By June 1945, the Americans had successfully evacuated V-2 components, documentation, and scientists from areas about to fall under Soviet control. They shipped everything to the United States, with the components going to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, and the scientists initially being held at Fort Bliss in Texas. The Soviets, arriving days later at Mittelwerk and other sites, found little of value. The Americans had won the race for German rocket technology. Now they had to figure out what to do with it. While the Americans were evacuating V-2 components and scientists from Germany, the Soviet Union was conducting its own massive technology capture operation. Soviet intelligence had been aware of the German rocket program since at least 1943, and Stalin had ordered that capturing this technology was a top priority. Soviet teams were searching the same areas as the Americans, often arriving just days behind. What followed was a technological Cold War that began even before World War II officially ended. The Soviets discovered quickly that the Americans had beaten them to the prize. When Soviet forces occupied Mittelwerk in late May 1945, they found the facility largely stripped of valuable equipment and components. American teams had removed approximately 75% of the useful material. The Soviets were furious, but not defeated. They began their own search for German rocket scientists who hadn't been captured by the Americans. They also started examining what remained at various sites, slowly piecing together information about the V-2. What the Soviets lacked in captured hardware, they made up for in ruthlessness. In October 1946, Soviet forces conducted a massive roundup of German rocket specialists, their families, and anyone associated with the rocket program who remained in Soviet-occupied territory. Approximately 2,000 German engineers, technicians, and their dependents were forcibly relocated to the Soviet Union. While these Germans weren't treated as harshly as prisoners, they weren't free to leave either. They would spend years working on Soviet rocket programs before being allowed to return home. The Americans, meanwhile, were beginning to understand just how advanced the V-2 actually was. Engineers examining the captured components were impressed by the sophisticated engineering. The V-2's engine produced over 56,000 pounds of thrust by burning ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen, a mixture that required precise control to prevent explosions. The fuel pumps were powered by a steam turbine that generated over 500 horsepower. The guidance system used gyroscopes and an analog computer to maintain the rocket on course. For 1945 technology, it was extraordinarily advanced. But understanding the components and actually assembling a working rocket were two different things. The Americans had parts, but not necessarily complete instruction manuals. Many of the German scientists were engineers who had worked on specific subsystems and didn't understand the complete rocket. And nobody in America had ever assembled or launched a V-2. Everything would have to be figured out through trial and error with help from the German scientists who were still adjusting to their new circumstances. The decision was made to attempt assembling and test firing a V-2 as quickly as possible. This would serve multiple purposes. It would prove that the Americans actually understood what they had captured. It would provide valuable data on how the rocket performed. It would train American engineers and technicians in rocket technology. And perhaps most importantly, it would demonstrate to the Soviets that America now possessed operational ballistic missile capability. The target date was set for early summer 1945. American engineers had 6 weeks to assemble a German superweapon and make it fly. The work began at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, a remote military facility that had been chosen as the site for American rocket testing. Conditions were primitive. White Sands was essentially desert with minimal facilities. Engineers worked in the blazing New Mexico sun, assembling rocket components that had been shipped from Germany in crates. The German scientists advised, pointing out which parts went where and how everything connected. But the actual assembly work was done by American technicians who were learning as they went. Every component had to be checked and tested. The fuel tanks had to be pressure tested to ensure they wouldn't leak or rupture. The engine had to be assembled correctly with thousands of individual parts fit together with precise tolerances. The guidance system had to be calibrated. The fuel pumps had to be tested to confirm they would provide the right flow rates. And all of this had to be done while understanding that one mistake could result in a catastrophic explosion. Wernher von Braun and his team of German scientists were essential to the effort. They could look at an assembly and immediately spot if something was wrong. They knew which tolerances were critical and which could be loosened. They understood the fuel mixture ratios and how the engine behaved during ignition. Without their expertise, the Americans would have spent months or years figuring out details that the Germans could explain in minutes. It was an uneasy partnership between former enemies. But both sides understood that success required cooperation. As the assembly work progressed, American engineers began to appreciate just how sophisticated the V-2 was. This wasn't a simple rocket. It was a complex system that required everything to work perfectly. The fuel had to be loaded at exactly the right temperature. The engine had to ignite in a precise sequence to prevent backfires. The guidance system had to activate at the right moment. One component failing could destroy the entire rocket. The Germans had spent over a decade developing this technology. The Americans were trying to master it in 6 weeks. By early July 1945, the first V-2 was nearly ready for launch at White Sands. American and German engineers had worked around the clock to assemble the rocket, install its guidance system, and prepare the launch pad. The rocket stood on its launch platform, a 46-foot-tall monument to German engineering and American determination. Now came the moment of truth. Would it actually work? The launch was scheduled for July 19, 1945, less than 6 weeks after the first components arrived at White Sands. It would be the first V-2 launch on American soil, and one of the first times Americans had attempted to launch anything more sophisticated than small research rockets. The pressure was enormous. Military brass, government officials, and scientists had gathered to watch. If this worked, it would validate the entire operation to capture German rocket technology. If it failed, critics would question whether the effort had been worthwhile. The countdown procedure was adapted from German protocols. Fuel trucks pumped ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen into the rocket's tanks. The frigid liquid oxygen caused frost to form on the outside of the rocket as moisture in the desert air condensed and froze. This was normal, the German scientists assured the Americans, though watching a rocket covered in ice in the middle of the New Mexico desert was surreal. As fueling completed, all personnel withdrew to bunkers located over a mile from the launch pad. Nobody wanted to be close if something went wrong. The final countdown began. At 60 seconds, automatic systems took over. The German guidance system, working perfectly despite being assembled by inexperienced American technicians, began its pre-flight checks. At 30 seconds, the fuel pumps spun up, pressurizing the fuel lines. At 10 seconds, the ignition sequence began. At 0, the V-2's engine ignited in a massive blast of flame and smoke. For a moment, the rocket just sat there, engine roaring, held down by the launch clamps. Then the clamps released, and the V-2 began to rise. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the German rocket climbed into the New Mexico sky. American engineers and officials watching from the bunkers could hardly believe what they were seeing. The rocket that had terrorized London was now flying under American control. It climbed higher and higher, leaving a trail of exhaust behind it. At about 25 seconds into flight, the rocket pitched over slightly as its guidance system corrected its trajectory. Then, at approximately 60 seconds, something went wrong. The rocket began to tumble. Its guidance system had failed, causing the rocket to lose control and start spinning. Without guidance, the V-2 couldn't maintain its trajectory. The engine was still producing thrust, but the rocket was now flying erratically. After about 70 seconds of flight, the rocket broke apart from aerodynamic stress, exploding in a spectacular fireball, visible for miles. Pieces of the rocket rained down across the desert. The first American launch of a V-2 had ended in failure. But the American team didn't see it as a failure. The rocket had launched successfully. The engine had worked perfectly. The fuel systems had performed as designed. The only failure was in the guidance system, and that could be fixed. More importantly, American engineers had learned an enormous amount from just watching the launch. They had seen how a large rocket behaved during liftoff. They had observed how the exhaust plume looked and sounded. They had collected data from ground instruments tracking the rocket. It was all valuable information that would be used to improve future launches. Over the following months, more V-2 rockets were assembled and launched at White Sands. Each launch taught the Americans something new. Some rockets failed, providing lessons about what could go wrong. Others succeeded, providing data about rocket performance at different altitudes and speeds. German scientists worked alongside American engineers, transferring their knowledge while learning about American engineering approaches. It was a collaborative effort that rapidly advanced American understanding of rocket technology. By the end of 1945, the Americans had successfully launched multiple V-2 rockets and were beginning to modify them for scientific research. The V-2 could reach altitudes that no other vehicle could achieve, making it perfect for high-altitude research. Scientists began proposing experiments that could be carried on V-2 rockets. Cameras to photograph Earth from space, instruments to measure atmospheric conditions at extreme altitudes, biological experiments to study how living organisms responded to spaceflight. The V-2, which had been a weapon of terror, was being transformed into a tool of scientific discovery. The 6 weeks from capturing the first V-2 components to launching the first rocket had been a crash course in advanced technology. American engineers had learned more about rockets in those 6 weeks than they had in the previous decade. The knowledge gained from studying German technology and working with German scientists had given America a massive head start in what would become the space race. The V-2 launches at White Sands were the beginning of America's journey to space. A journey that started with captured enemy technology, but would eventually lead to achievements the Germans had never imagined. The V-2 launches at White Sands in 1945 and 46 were just the beginning of America's rocket program. But they were a crucial beginning. Without the captured German technology and expertise, American rocket development would have taken decades longer. The V-2 provided a working example of how to build a large liquid-fueled rocket, teaching American engineers lessons that couldn't have been learned any other way, except through years of expensive trial and error. Between 1946 and 1952, the United States launched over 60 V-2 rockets from White Sands. These launches served multiple purposes. Some were training missions, teaching American engineers and technicians how to assemble, fuel, and launch large rockets. Others carried scientific instruments to high altitude, collecting data that had never been obtained before. A few carried live animals, including fruit flies, mice, and eventually a monkey, testing whether living organisms could survive rocket flight. Each launch added to American knowledge and capabilities. The data collected from V-2 flights was revolutionary for its time. Cameras carried on V-2 rockets took the first photographs of Earth from space, showing the curvature of the planet against the blackness of space. These images, grainy and black and white by modern standards, were stunning in 1946. They showed that spaceflight was possible and gave humans their first glimpse of what astronauts would see a decade later. Scientists studying atmospheric physics got data on temperature, pressure, and composition at altitudes that had been pure speculation before. But the Americans weren't content to simply launch captured German rockets indefinitely. They wanted to develop their own rocket technology, using what they had learned from the V-2 as a foundation. Wernher von Braun and his team of German scientists were put to work designing new rockets for American purposes. The first generation of American rockets, including the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, were direct descendants of the V-2, incorporating many of the same design principles, but with improvements based on American research. The Soviet Union was conducting similar work with their captured V-2 components and German scientists. The Soviets had gotten less hardware than the Americans, but were pursuing rocket development aggressively. By the early 1950s, both superpowers had operational ballistic missiles based on V-2 technology. The Cold War arms race that would define the second half of the 20th century was being fought with weapons descended from Hitler's wonder weapon. The V-2, which had failed to save Nazi Germany, had become the foundation for the nuclear standoff between America and the Soviet Union. But rockets weren't just weapons. Wernher von Braun had always dreamed of using rockets for space exploration, and he began advocating for an American space program as early as the late 1940s. At first, the military wasn't interested. Rockets were weapons, not exploration vehicles. But von Braun was persistent, writing articles, giving lectures, and appearing on television to promote the idea of space travel. His vision of humans traveling to other worlds captured public imagination, even if the military remained skeptical. Everything changed in October 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Americans were shocked that the Soviets had beaten them into space. The space race had begun, and America was behind. President Eisenhower ordered an American satellite program, and suddenly von Braun and his team were given the resources and authority they had been seeking for years. The Explorer 1 satellite, America's first satellite, was launched in January 1958 on a rocket designed by von Braun's team at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. The creation of NASA in 1958 formalized America's commitment to space exploration. Von Braun and his team were transferred from the Army to NASA, where they began work on rockets that would eventually take Americans to the moon. The Saturn V rocket, which launched the Apollo missions, was designed by von Braun and represented the culmination of everything he had learned from his work on the V-2, the Redstone, and subsequent American rockets. The Saturn V was over 30 times more powerful than the V-2, but the basic principles were the same. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, they did so because of a chain of technological development that began with the V-2. The rocket that had bombed London had provided the foundation for the rocket that took humans to another world. It was one of history's great ironies. A weapon of destruction had become the key to humanity's greatest peaceful achievement. And the man who had designed the V-2, weapon for Hitler, had fulfilled his dream of sending humans into space, just working for a different nation than he had originally expected. The moral complications of Operation Paperclip and America's use of German rocket scientists troubled many people both at the time and in the decades since. Wernher von Braun and others had been members of the Nazi Party. They had overseen production that used slave labor. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners died building V-2 rockets under their watch. Should these men have been prosecuted as war criminals, or was using their knowledge to advance American interests justified? It's a question that still generates debate. The American government's position was pragmatic. If we don't take these scientists, the Soviets will, and that would give them an advantage we can't afford. In the context of the Cold War, with the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over the world, that argument made sense to policymakers. The scientists themselves claimed they were apolitical engineers interested only in rockets, that they had no choice but to work for the Nazis, that they were as much victims as anyone. How much truth there was in these claims varies from person to person, and the full story is complex and morally ambiguous. What's undeniable is that Operation Paperclip dramatically accelerated American rocket and space technology development. The knowledge captured from Germany in 1945 saved America decades of research. The V-2 provided a working example that American engineers could study, copy, and improve upon. The German scientists brought expertise that America simply didn't have in the immediate post-war period. Without this technology transfer, America's space program would have developed very differently and probably much more slowly. Today, when we look at spacecraft launching from Cape Canaveral or watch rovers exploring Mars, we're seeing the distant descendants of the V-2 rocket. The technology has advanced enormously, but the fundamental principles of liquid-fueled rocketry that the Germans pioneered in the 1930s and 40s are still in use. Every rocket that launches today owes something to the V-2, the weapon that became the foundation of space exploration. And every American achievement in space owes something to the 6 weeks in 1945, when American engineers figured out how to copy Hitler's wonder weapon and make it their own. The V-2 was a weapon of terror that killed thousands. It was also a technological marvel that opened the door to space. It represented the worst of humanity, built by slave labor for purposes of destruction. But it also represented human ingenuity and the drive to reach for the impossible. The story of how America captured this technology and transformed it from a weapon into a tool of exploration is one of the most fascinating chapters in both military and space history. It shows how technology itself is morally neutral, taking its character from how it's used, and how the same innovation that brings death can also bring discovery. The V-2's journey from Nazi superweapon to American space program icon is a story of technology, politics, moral compromise, and ultimately, achievement. It's a story that began with a desperate search through the ruins of Germany and ended with footprints on the moon.